A flight crew duct-taped a black CEO's teen son to his seat and beat him in front of horrified passengers. Minutes later, the CEO made them beg for mercy at 30,000 feet. What happens next will leave you speechless. They bound an innocent child with tape, mocking him as if no one would fight back. Subscribe if you believe cruelty should never be ignored. The hum of the Concordair jet vibrated through the cabin as the seatbelt signs dimmed, but the tension in the air was already sharp enough to be felt. Darius Kellen adjusted the infant carrier strapped firmly to his chest, one hand resting gently on his son Malik's back. The baby stirred softly, his small breaths warm against Darius's shirt. Around them, passengers settled into their seats, their conversations hushed, their eyes darting now and then toward the man they recognized. A few phones glimmered discreetly as photos were snapped, whispers rippling like a quiet undercurrent. The billionaire CEO of Oralis Systems was on board, sitting among them with a baby in his arms. To most, it was a curious sight. To the flight crew, it was an invitation to sharpen old grudges against men who carried themselves with power. Chief Attendant Boyd Trask's gaze lingered longer than it should have. His eyes narrowed beneath heavy brows. His jaw worked as if chewing on some unspoken bitterness, his entire posture radiating irritation. Years of stalled promotions and failed ambitions had turned Boyd into a man who found satisfaction only in belittling others. And now, faced with Darius's calm, composed demeanor, that bitterness began to churn. He moved stiffly through the aisle, his footsteps deliberate, his lips pressed into a thin smile that never touched his eyes. Two younger attendants followed close behind, Reno Malloy and Brent Calder, their sneers thinly disguised as professional indifference. Reno's glances toward Darius were quick but cutting, each one laced with mockery. Brent, lankier and more reckless in his movements, let his disdain show in the way he slammed carts into place or brushed too close to Darius's seat. They mirrored Boyd's contempt with every gesture, as if competing for his approval. Darius noticed. He always noticed. Years of corporate boardrooms where rivals masked hostility with charm had sharpened his instincts. Yet instead of reacting, he shifted Malik slightly in the carrier, humming low to keep him calm. The baby's eyes fluttered, and for a moment the harshness of the cabin softened. Darius breathed steadily, his gaze fixed on nothing, his thoughts elsewhere, on the endless negotiations that had marked his day, on the rivals who would gladly see him fail, and now on the task of returning home safely. When Boyd approached with the beverage cart, the encounter carried a weight that the passengers around them seemed to feel. "Would you like something to drink, sir?" Boyd asked, his tone clipped, his mouth twisted into a shape that suggested forced politeness. "Water will be fine," Darius replied evenly. His voice carried authority but also restraint, the calm of a man used to balancing power with patience. Boyd poured the water slowly, too slowly, his eyes fixed on Darius with an unspoken challenge. He handed over the cup without a word of courtesy, the glass nearly slipping from his grasp as though he enjoyed the thought of it spilling. Darius caught it without reaction, his fingers steady. He lifted it carefully away from Malik and set it on the tray, offering no acknowledgement of the petty gesture. Behind Boyd, Reno leaned closer to Brent and muttered, "Some people think they're too important for the rest of us." His words weren't meant to carry, but they did. Darius heard them. A few passengers nearby did too. One man shifted uncomfortably, pulling out a magazine to bury his face. Another looked down at his phone, pretending not to listen. The cruelty was subtle but unmistakable, a deliberate attempt to cut at Darius's dignity in front of others. Malik stirred, letting out a soft cry that pierced the low drone of the engines. Darius rocked him gently, whispering, "It's all right, son. We'll be home soon." His voice carried warmth, but his eyes hardened. Every instinct told him this was no ordinary flight. The whispers, the stares, the crew's disdain, it was all converging into something he could not yet name. Boyd passed again, his eyes narrowing further as Malik fussed louder. "You might want to keep control of him," Boyd said flatly, his words like a knife sliding beneath the skin of civility. Darius lifted his chin slightly. "He's an infant," he replied, his tone calm, measured. "I assure you, I have him under control." Boyd smirked but said nothing. Reno rolled his eyes openly. Brent chuckled low in his throat as though amused by some private joke. Their contempt was no longer hidden, and it rippled through the cabin like an echo of something far larger than a crying child. Passengers shifted in their seats, some sneaking glances, others refusing to look at all. Dramatic irony thickened the air. Most saw only a mild clash, a hint of rudeness. But beneath the surface, an invisible storm was building, fueled by resentment, prejudice, and the unspoken power struggle between a man carrying the weight of global influence and a crew desperate to tear him down. Darius knew better than to escalate. He drew a slow breath, his hand pressing lightly against Malik's back, grounding himself. He had faced worse battles in boardrooms where fortunes hung on single words. But this was different. This was personal. He could feel it in the way Boyd lingered too long near his row, in the way Reno's laughter cut sharp against Malik's cries, in the way Brent leaned against the galley wall as though waiting for the moment when irritation could explode into something darker. The hum of the engines pressed in, steady but oppressive. Every detail etched itself into Darius's mind, the glint of the overhead lights on Boyd's watch, the tremor in Malik's cry, the uneasy shifting of passengers caught between curiosity and fear. He filed it all away, his thoughts already calculating, his instincts already sharpening. He would not give them the satisfaction of breaking his composure, not now. But as he sat in the narrow seat, rocking his son against the backdrop of whispers and hidden smirks, he felt the unmistakable weight of foreshadowing. Something in the air told him that this flight would not end as it had begun. The smallest acts of hostility were seeds, and seeds had a way of growing into something impossible to ignore. What the passengers saw was a composed executive cradling his baby. What Boyd saw was an opportunity to humiliate a man he secretly despised. The atmosphere of the cabin grew tense as small acts of hostility, missed service, deliberate delays, foreshadowed something darker. He didn't yet realize that the flight would become a war zone for his dignity. The soft whimper of Malik broke through the steady hum of the engines, a sound that should have been ordinary and unremarkable, yet inside the pressurized cabin it drew sharp attention. Boyd's eyes flicked over from the galley, narrowing as if the infant's cry were an intentional insult. He lingered there for too long, his expression hard and pointed, before continuing down the aisle. The tension hung heavy, thick enough that nearby passengers shifted in their seats, glancing sideways but avoiding any direct involvement. Reno passed by next, his posture stiff, his stride exaggerated with purpose. As he leaned close enough for only Darius to hear, his lips curled into a sneer. "Some people don't know when to keep control," he muttered, the words dripping with contempt. He didn't slow down after speaking, instead carrying on as though nothing had been said, leaving the sting of insult to hang between them. Darius tightened his grip on the carrier against his chest, his jaw setting firmly, but his eyes never left his child. He had faced boardrooms filled with rivals who tried to dismantle him with sharper words than this, but here, the insult cut differently. It wasn't about him, it was about Malik. The baby's fussing grew louder, his small hands twitching as he squirmed, a perfectly natural act of discomfort. Yet the crew treated it as if it were a disruption of order itself. Brent, from a few rows ahead, exchanged a look with Reno and exaggerated a sigh, rolling his eyes theatrically so that a group of passengers could see. Some chuckled nervously, others frowned, but no one spoke. Their silence was its own betrayal. Darius noticed every glance, every shifting body, and he measured the weight of it all. His instincts told him the hostility was not fleeting, it was a tide rising, and he had to decide when to stand against it. "Excuse me," Darius said calmly, his voice level, his words measured as he raised his hand slightly to catch Boyd's attention. "Could I get some warm water for my son's bottle?" His tone carried no sharpness, no arrogance, only the steady resolve of a father making a simple request. Boyd turned, and for a moment his expression was professional. But as he disappeared into the galley, the mask slipped. Minutes later, he returned with a cup in hand, steam curling upward from its surface. He set it down with deliberate precision on Darius's tray table. The smirk at the corner of his mouth betrayed his intent before Darius even touched it. The water was scalding hot, dangerously so. Darius's heart clenched, his instincts igniting. He reached out, brushing the rim, and immediately recoiled. Without hesitation, he began the careful process of cooling it down, dipping a finger, waiting, blowing across the surface. His movements were calm, but inside, fury threatened to break through. He recognized the cruelty for what it was. Not an accident, but a message. Boyd's eyes lingered on him, waiting for a reaction, but Darius gave none. His face remained a mask of quiet composure as he tested the water again and again until it was safe. Then, gently, he prepared Malik's bottle, his hands steady despite the storm within him. Malik's cries softened as he fed, small gulps filling the silence that Boyd had tried to poison. Around them, passengers shifted again, some whispering quietly, others staring fixedly at their armrests as though avoiding involvement would absolve them. One man, 2 rows behind, leaned forward slightly, his phone angled subtly as if he might be recording. Darius noticed, tucked it away in memory, but didn't allow his eyes to linger. Every detail mattered now, the alliances, the betrayals, the evidence. Boyd leaned closer, his voice pitched low, almost conversational, though it carried the weight of menace. "Careful, sir. Accidents happen when people don't follow instructions." His breath was hot, his words slow, measured, meant to cut. Darius looked up at him, his expression unreadable, his silence more powerful than any retort. Inside, however, a line had been drawn. His objective was clear: protect his son at all costs. Escalation would come, but not yet, not until the balance tipped beyond control. For now, endurance was his strategy, and patience his weapon. Reno and Brent exchanged another glance, their smirks widening. They thought they had begun to strip away his dignity in small, invisible slices. They thought they were winning. The passengers thought they were witnessing discomfort, nothing more, something unpleasant but fleeting. Only Darius understood the truth, that these were not random acts of bitterness. They were the opening moves of something calculated, something meant to break him down. He adjusted Malik's carrier, held him a little tighter, and breathed deeply, steadying himself against the rising hostility. He would not give them the satisfaction of seeing fear. He would not hand them victory in the form of weakness. The hum of the engines continued, steady and unbroken, but the atmosphere inside the cabin shifted. Beneath the sterile lights, beneath the polite chatter of passengers who pretended nothing was happening, a storm was already forming. Each glare, each whispered insult, each small act of cruelty was another roll of thunder building in the distance. The crew believed they were in control, but they were too blind to see how fragile their power really was. And as Darius stared forward, blood humming with the dual weight of rage and restraint, he understood something the others did not. Storms do not stay silent forever. They break, they roar, they destroy. A storm was already forming inside the sealed belly of that plane. Boyd's voice sliced through the cabin like a whip. "Move the child to his own seat," he barked, his tone sharp enough to silence the faint hum of conversation around them. Passengers glanced up from their magazines and phones, their eyes darting between the stern attendant and the father holding his infant son. Darius's grip on Malik tightened instinctively, his chest rising and falling with steady control as he replied, "Sir, regulations permit him to remain in the carrier. I can show you the guidelines if you'd like." His voice carried calm authority, but beneath it was a quiet urgency. He already sensed that this demand was not about safety. It was about power. Boyd's lips curled into a thin smile that did nothing to mask his contempt. "You'll follow instructions, or you'll be treated as non-compliant," he snapped, raising his voice deliberately so nearby passengers could hear. The false cloak of authority hung heavy on his words, and Reno Malloy and Brent Calder moved in behind him like shadows, their stances stiff, their eyes glinting with a rehearsed smugness. They were not enforcing rules, they were performing domination. Passengers exchanged uneasy whispers, some lifting phones discreetly, others sinking lower into their seats as if hoping invisibility would shield them from involvement. Darius could feel the weight of those eyes on him, the silent question trembling in the air. Would he resist? His jaw tightened. He shifted Malik higher against his chest, the baby's soft whimper brushing against his collarbone. "I will not place my son alone on that seat," he said, his tone firm, his words clipped but respectful. His body was calm, but his eyes held a steady fire. Boyd's nostrils flared as though the refusal were a personal insult. For a moment his hand twitched at his side, then, with a suddenness that froze the aisle, he reached into the galley and pulled out a roll of duct tape. The metallic cylinder glinted dully under the overhead lights, its presence a grotesque intrusion in the polished cabin. Gasps rippled from the passengers as Boyd let the roll hang loosely from his fingers, a cold smile spreading across his face. "If you won't listen," he said with chilling ease, "we'll make sure he's secured." The sight of the tape snapped Darius into motion. His voice thundered across the aisle. "Don't you dare touch my child!" His words cracked with both fury and fear, but before he could rise fully, Reno and Brent lunged forward. Their movements were practiced as though they had prepared for this moment. Reno gripped Darius's shoulder with crushing force, while Brent shoved his free hand against Darius's chest, pinning him momentarily against the seat. Malik's cry, sharp and panicked, split the cabin as Boyd tore the baby from his father's arms with a brutality that made even hardened passengers flinch. Darius's roar shook the cabin walls. He surged upward, straining against the men holding him, but Reno's elbow drove into his ribs, stealing the breath from his lungs. Brent pressed him back down, their combined weight holding him in place as though they were restraining a dangerous criminal rather than a desperate father. Boyd, unmoved by the cries around him, worked swiftly. He ripped strips of tape with vicious precision, each tear echoing like thunder in the stunned silence. Malik's tiny body writhed against the cold seat as the tape bit into the fabric, binding him in place. His small arms flailed helplessly, but the restraints held, his terrified sobs muffled by the oppressive hum of the engines above. A hush fell over the cabin. Some passengers clutched their armrests, others covered their mouths, eyes wide in horror. One man angled his phone discreetly, his hands trembling as he tried to capture the unfolding madness without drawing attention. The air grew heavy with fear and disbelief, the collective paralysis of a crowd unsure how far the violence would go. Pinned against the seat, Darius's vision tunneled. Blood roared in his ears as every fiber of his being screamed to break free, to rip through Reno and Brent, to tear the tape from his son's body. But his mind, disciplined and razor-sharp even under agony, held him back. Recklessness would only risk Malik's safety further. His breaths came ragged, controlled through clenched teeth, his eyes locked on his son as though sheer will could shield him from the cruelty. Boyd stepped back at last, surveying his work with twisted satisfaction. The baby, bound and sobbing, was no longer in his father's arms but strapped to the seat like luggage. The cabin lights flickered faintly with the steady vibration of the plane, casting shadows across Boyd's cold grin. Passengers shifted again, some whispering prayers, others shaking their heads in disbelief. Yet no one moved. Fear, thick and choking, kept them seated, kept their voices low. The weight of silence became its own act of complicity, every second stretching into eternity. For Darius, the world had narrowed to a single, burning objective. His body ached from the blows, his chest heaved with restrained fury, but his mind was locked on the image before him. His son, vulnerable and bound, suffering because of men drunk on bitterness. Rage simmered beneath his calm exterior, an unbroken vow forming within him. This humiliation would not stand. This cruelty would not go unanswered. Boyd, Reno, and Brent believed they had asserted dominance, but they had only drawn the first lines in a battle far greater than they could comprehend. The seeds of their downfall were already taking root in the quiet rebellion of hidden cameras, in the smoldering fire behind Darius's eyes, in the passengers' whispered disbelief that would soon erupt into action. The baby's cries echoed like a siren of injustice, each sound branding itself into the minds of those who heard it. And as Darius sat there, bloodied but unbroken, his vow hardened into steel. Whatever it took, he would reclaim his son, and the men who dared to strip him of his dignity would learn the cost of their cruelty. The line between order and madness had just been crossed. Chaos erupted when Boyd, without hesitation, brought the back of his hand down across Malik's tiny face. The sound was sharp, shocking in its cruelty, and it cut through the low hum of the engines like a gunshot. Gasps filled the cabin as the infant's head jerked to the side, a thin line of blood running from his nose and soaking into the tape that held him bound to the seat. The sight was unbearable. Malik's cries, already muffled by the restraint, broke into a desperate wail that pierced every heart within earshot. "Stop!" Darius roared, his voice raw with anguish. His body surged forward instinctively, fueled by nothing but a father's desperation. But before his hands could reach the child, Reno slammed his shoulder into him with the force of a battering ram. The impact sent Darius sprawling back into the aisle, his arms flailing as his head clipped the edge of a seat. The sting of the blow blurred his vision, but his mind refused to yield. Brent joined in, his face twisted into a sneer, his fists already clenched. He drove his knuckles into Darius's ribs, each strike a dull, punishing thud that reverberated through bone. Darius grunted with pain, clutching at the armrest for balance, but another elbow from Reno cracked against the side of his skull. He staggered, collapsing against the cold floor of the cabin. The carpet scraped his cheek, already slick with blood. "Pathetic," Reno spat, his voice dripping with mockery as he pressed his weight down on Darius's chest. "Hold him there," Boyd ordered, his voice booming like a commander giving orders in battle. The chief attendant's eyes gleamed with vindictive satisfaction, his breathing heavy as though each act of cruelty fueled him further. Passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some turned their faces away, unable to watch the beating unfold. A few raised shaky voices, shouting protests that dissolved under the weight of Boyd's glare. One man half rose from his seat, but Brent's quick step toward him and a threatening gesture sent him back down. Fear ruled the cabin, stifling courage before it could take form. Meanwhile, Malik's cries continued, desperate and broken. His small chest heaved with each sob, his body trembling against the crude tape that held him captive. The sight of his son's torment burned into Darius's soul, each second igniting a deeper fury inside him. Yet even as fists and elbows rained down upon him, he forced himself not to break. He knew strength was not only about striking back, it was about enduring, waiting for the right moment. Through blurred vision, Darius scanned the rows. He saw the glint of a phone angled discreetly, a passenger recording despite the risk. He memorized faces, marking those who dared to watch and those who would remain witnesses to the truth. The humiliation cut deeper than the blows themselves. Every strike was meant to strip away his dignity, to make him kneel not just in body, but in spirit. But Darius refused. His breath came heavy, his ribs searing with pain, but his mind remained clear. He absorbed the punishment with a terrifying composure, calculating even as blood trickled into his mouth. "You think your wealth means anything here?" Boyd sneered, standing over him. "Up here, you're just another man who needs to be taught his place." Darius's lip curled into the faintest grimace, but he stayed silent. The restraint unnerved Boyd more than a scream ever could. It was not submission, it was defiance, hidden beneath bruises and blood. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken promises. Passengers felt it too. They leaned forward in their seats, torn between fear and the dawning realization that the man pinned to the floor was not broken. Foreshadowing lingered in the stale cabin air, invisible but suffocating. Every act of cruelty, every insult and strike was weaving a noose around the attackers' necks. The very power they thought unshakable was already beginning to tilt against them. And Darius, even crushed under fists and humiliation, knew it. His mind repeated a single vow: survive this moment, protect his son, and wait for the opening that would come. The blows might tear into his body, but each one brought him closer to the shift he knew was inevitable. Boyd leaned in again, his expression twisted with arrogance. "Look at you," he taunted, his voice meant to humiliate in front of every watching eye. "All that power, and nothing you can do for your child?" Darius met his gaze, blood streaming down the side of his face, and in that look alone was a promise of retribution. He would not forget. He would not forgive. And when the moment came, Boyd would regret ever raising a hand against Malik. The scene settled into a tense stillness. Renault pressed harder against his chest, Brent's fist lingered near his face, and Boyd hovered above with his cruel smirk. Around them, passengers sat frozen, trapped between fear and silent horror. And still, through every strike, every insult, Darius's resolve sharpened. He knew that in their cruelty they had already condemned themselves. In their cruelty, they had planted the seeds of their own undoing. Boyd's fist crashed against Darius's jaw with a sickening crack, the force sending him stumbling sideways until his shoulder slammed against the armrest of a seat. He nearly lost his balance, but caught himself with one hand pressed against the back of a chair. Blood welled at the corner of his mouth and spilled freely, dripping onto the pale blue carpet beneath his shoes. The cabin fell silent for a heartbeat, the only sound Malik's desperate wails as the baby writhed against the duct tape that bound him. The cries clawed at Darius's heart like fire, but even through the dizziness and pain, he lifted his head, eyes sharp with unyielding resolve. He refused to crumble. Renault, smirking with the reckless arrogance of a man drunk on power, leaned closer as though savoring the sight. "That's right," he muttered, his voice low and venomous, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Men like you think you're untouchable. But up here, we decide who's in control. We put important men back in their place." His tone carried mockery but also a cruel satisfaction, as if years of bitterness were being poured into every word. Brent laughed loudly, slapping the back of a seat as though cheering on a sport. His amusement cut like a knife, echoing across the rows. "Look at him," Brent jeered, gesturing toward Darius's bloodied face. He's not a leader here, he's nothing, just another man brought down where it counts. The words struck deep, but they did not break Darius. Instead, they ignited a cold fire inside him. His son's muffled cries rose higher, each sound tearing at him, each whimper strengthening his resolve. His gaze locked on Malik, his tiny hands twitching helplessly against the tape, and his chest ached with the weight of fury. Around them, the passengers shifted uncomfortably, their fear palpable. Some raised phones discreetly, screens glowing faintly in the dimmed cabin lights. Others kept their eyes fixed on their laps, too afraid to witness what was unfolding. The atmosphere was thick with tension, an invisible weight pressing down on everyone present. Yet Darius noticed those faint glimmers of resistance, the trembling hands gripping phones tighter, the whispers passed between rows. Evidence was being captured, silent witnesses turning cruelty into permanent proof. Boyd, still looming, spat his venomous words with a sneer that dripped disdain. "No fortune, no company, no title matters up here," he declared, voice raised so all could hear. His teeth were bared, his eyes burning with the kind of hatred that fed off humiliation. "You're nothing but another passenger, and you'll remember that every time you bleed." Darius wiped the blood from his chin with the back of his hand. He did not argue, did not shout. He lowered his head, letting them see only a bowed figure as if beaten. But behind the mask of submission, his mind was alive, sharper than ever. He thought of every camera pointed his way, every passenger too shaken to intervene but brave enough to record. Each blow, each insult, each hateful word was no longer just pain, it was evidence. He forced himself to stay still, muscles taut with restrained fury, while Reno smirked and Brent chuckled cruelly. They believed the silence meant surrender, that his lowered head meant defeat. But Darius was calculating. He was letting them expose their ugliest selves in full view of witnesses. He would not waste his strength striking blindly now. Instead, he would allow them to dig their own graves, every moment etched into digital memory that would outlast the walls of this plane. Inside, he repeated a single promise. Malik would be safe, and these men would pay. His power was not bound to this cabin, nor to their fists. His reach stretched across industries, governments, and media outlets, threads of influence woven carefully over years. They thought they were breaking a man, but they were forging the very weapon that would destroy them. Boyd leaned closer, his breath hot with rage, certain he had stripped Darius of every ounce of dignity. Reno muttered another insult, and Brent's laughter rose again, but none of it pierced the calm mask that Darius now wore. His silence unnerved them in ways they couldn't recognize. It was the silence of a man who had already decided their fate. Passengers exchanged looks, some daring to lift their cameras higher, emboldened by his refusal to break. The sense of dramatic irony thickened like a storm cloud. The crew believed they were kings of the cabin, yet the truth was already slipping from their grasp, carried in every glowing screen and every recorded second. Blood still dripped to the carpet, the metallic taste thick in Darius's mouth, but his voice remained silent. His thoughts were not of surrender, but of timing. Patience was his weapon now. Let them believe. Let them mock. Let them feel invincible so their collapse would be all the greater. His eyes, hidden beneath a lowered brow, gleamed with a cold certainty. He would not just defend his son, he would make them beg for mercy. And as the cabin pressed in with tension, his silence whispered louder than any scream. The hourglass of their dominance had already started to run out. Boyd tore another strip of duct tape with a sharp rip that cut through the tense silence, the sound louder than the hum of the engines. He yanked Malik's tiny body forward, wrapping the tape around his torso in harsh layers, pinning the infant's arms so tightly that his cries shifted from sharp wails to muffled, strangled whimpers. The baby squirmed helplessly, his small chest rising in shallow, frightened gasps. Darius's heart thundered. His body, aching and bruised, surged forward with sudden fury, but before he could close the distance, Reno slammed into him with brute force. The impact knocked him hard into the seat back, the metal armrest digging deep into his ribs. Darius's breath caught in his throat, pain shooting like fire through his side, but his eyes never left Malik. His son's face was red and streaked with tears, the glimmer of tape shining cruelly under the cabin lights. He lunged again, desperation overriding the agony in his body, but Brent was already waiting. The attendant snatched a metal serving tray from the galley and swung it like a weapon. The tray connected with Darius's shoulder in a sickening crash, sending him sprawling across the narrow aisle. His temple struck the carpeted floor, and for a brief second his vision swam with darkness, blood pooling at the edge of his brow. Gasps broke from the passengers around them. Several men half rose from their seats, hands gripping armrests as if ready to intervene, but Boyd's booming voice shattered their courage. "Sit down, or you'll join him." His command carried a cruel authority, every word thrown like a lash across the cabin. The men sank back down, their knuckles white, their fear outweighing their anger. Mothers clutched their sons closer, older men stared at the floor, and silence spread like a disease through the rows. Still, not all were silent. The faint glow of cell phone screens flickered like stars in the dimmed cabin, recording every act of brutality. Fingers trembled as they gripped devices, some hidden under jackets, others shielded behind magazines. The rebellion was quiet but undeniable. The evidence of what was unfolding was being preserved, even if the passengers themselves could not yet find the courage to stand. Darius coughed, spitting blood onto the carpet as he struggled to lift himself to one elbow. His body screamed with pain, his ribs burning, his shoulder throbbing from the blow of the tray. But his mind refused to surrender. Through the haze, he forced himself to observe, to calculate. Each second, he noted who looked away, who whispered, who trembled. Witnesses mattered, and though they seemed powerless now, their presence was already building a wall of truth that Boyd and his men could not escape. Reno loomed over him, smirking as he pushed Darius back down with a hand on his chest. "Stay down," he hissed, his face twisted in mock superiority. Darius met his eyes, blood streaking down his cheek, and though his lips did not move, his stare was unbroken. Silence was his only weapon at that moment, and it unsettled Reno more than any shout could have. Boyd returned to Malik, pressing the tape once more as though binding an object, not a child. "Look at him," Boyd sneered, turning toward Darius, helpless, just like his father. His words were designed to humiliate, to break Darius's spirit in front of everyone, but the effect was the opposite. The sight of his baby taped so cruelly, his face wet with tears, hardened Darius's resolve like steel. Passengers shifted uneasily in their seats. A few muttered under their breath, but none dared rise. The balance of power seemed unshakable, yet dramatic irony hung heavy in the air. The men believed they were in control, blind to the truth that their every cruelty only tightened the noose around their own necks. Blood dripped steadily from Darius's temple, staining the aisle carpet, but his thoughts were sharp. He would endure. He would absorb every strike, every insult, every ounce of cruelty. Because beyond this moment lay something greater. He could already see the outlines of justice forming, faint but undeniable in the hands of those recording silently. Boyd stepped back, satisfied with his work, and folded the duct tape with a snap. Malik's cries had grown faint, muffled behind the restraints. The sound tore at Darius's soul, but instead of breaking him, it forged him. His breath came ragged, his muscles trembling, but his mind burned with the fire of resolve. He was battered, bloodied, and humiliated, but he was not defeated. In that dim, oppressive cabin, amid fear and silence, a transformation took place. The cruelty that rained down on him was not the end. It was the sharpening of his resolve, the forging of a blade in fire. Sometimes the darkest moment is only the sharpening of the blade. Boyd's cruelty crossed an even darker line when he leaned toward Malik and pressed a finger against the baby's bloodied face. The gesture was slow, deliberate, as if he wanted everyone in the cabin to see his authority written in that single vile touch. Malik's small body shuddered under the restraint of the duct tape, his muffled cries rattling the air. Boyd's lips curled into a sneer. "This is what happens when men think their money makes them untouchable," he hissed, his voice dripping with venom. The words were not just meant for Darius. They were a proclamation to the entire cabin, a declaration that he, not the man bound before him, ruled this space. The cruel emphasis in his tone revealed his obsession. It was never only about silencing a crying baby. It was about tearing down the image of power Darius carried with him like an invisible crown. Darius's chest heaved, blood running down his temple, every nerve inside him screaming to protect his son. His eyes locked on Boyd's finger against Malik's cheek, and a fire burned behind them. But his arms, bound and bruised, refused him the right to act. The silence that escaped him was not weakness, it was discipline. He clenched his jaw, swallowing his rage, denying Boyd the satisfaction of hearing him plead. His refusal to speak became its own rebellion, unnerving the very men who wanted to break him. Brent, standing only a step behind Boyd, felt empowered by the show of cruelty. His fists tightened, his knuckles pale against his skin, and with a sudden burst of violence he drove his fist into Darius's ribs. The sound that followed, a sharp, sickening crack, was enough to silence even the faint murmurs of the passengers. Darius's breath caught in his throat as pain surged like fire through his side. The coppery taste of blood filled his mouth, yet he refused to let out a cry. He refused them that victory. He swayed, head low, breath shallow, his silence a wall that Boyd and his men could not breach. The attackers expected begging. They wanted to hear the pride of a powerful man crumble into desperate pleas. Instead, they were met with the quiet defiance of a man whose will outlasted their violence. That silence unsettled them more than screams ever could. Boyd's sneer faltered for the briefest moment, his eyes narrowing as if questioning whether the pain inflicted had landed its mark. But Reno, eager to prove his loyalty, stepped forward with his own display of disrespect. He reached down into Darius's belongings with careless hands, rummaging until he found the baby's bottle. He held it up, tilting it mockingly in front of Darius's face as if it were some prize of conquest. Then, without hesitation, he uncapped it, and with a flick of his wrist, poured the milk onto the carpet. The warm liquid splashed against the floor, seeping quickly into the fibers, creating a spreading stain beneath their feet. Reno's smile widened as he let the bottle fall empty, its hollow clatter echoing against the silence of the stunned cabin. Malik whimpered, his tiny mouth moving against the tape, hungry and afraid. Darius's heart twisted at the sight, yet his eyes did not waver. He forced his pain inward, turning it into fuel, sharpening it into something Boyd could not see. His silence, his stillness, his refusal to collapse was no longer just endurance. It was strategy. Every act of cruelty was being watched, remembered, recorded. Every moment was a noose tightening around the men who believed themselves untouchable. The cabin itself seemed to hold its breath. Passengers shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting between the crew and the father who endured. Some lowered their gaze, too fearful to meet his eyes, while others clutched their phones, thumbs hesitating over record buttons they had already pressed minutes before. The air was heavy with disbelief, the kind that lingers when cruelty crosses a threshold that decent men never imagined could be breached. Darius sat bloodied and battered, his ribs searing, his child bound and crying only feet away, and yet his silence rang louder than the crew's mockery. It was not the silence of surrender, but of calculation, of strength hidden in restraint. Boyd mistook it for defeat. Brent mistook it for weakness. Reno mistook it for emptiness. But the truth was far darker for them. Behind the blood and bruises, a transformation was taking place, one that none of them could perceive through their arrogance. Every sneer, every insult, every strike was laying the foundation for their downfall. The men thought they were erasing his power, but they were unknowingly chiseling their own ruin in front of an audience that would one day bear witness. Dramatic irony hung thick in the air. They wanted to crown themselves kings of the sky, but they had just crowned their own executioner. They believed they were kings of the sky, unaware they had just crowned their executioner. They beat a black CEO's baby. Certain silence and fear would protect them. If you believe every act of abuse must be answered, hit subscribe. Justice starts here. The plane jolted violently with sudden turbulence, trays clattering and carts sliding down the aisle as passengers gripped their armrests in alarm. The cabin lights flickered for a moment, casting an eerie glow over the chaos. Seizing the distraction, Darius pushed himself up, every muscle in his battered body screaming in protest. His breath was ragged, blood dripping into his eyes from the split above his brow, but his focus was absolute Malik. His infant son was only a few feet away, bound to the seat with duct tape, his cries muffled yet piercing, and nothing else in the world mattered. Darius lunged forward, his trembling hands clawing at the layers of tape around his child. The sticky strips resisted, pulling at his fingers as if the seat itself refused to give him back his son. His heart pounded in his chest, each thud like a drum of desperation. Just as he tore one strip partially loose, Boyd crashed into him from the side. The chief attendant's weight slammed Darius against the armrest, forcing the air from his lungs with a brutal grunt. They tumbled into the aisle, wrestling in the narrow space as the plane shook again. Fists struck with sickening thuds. Elbows dug into ribs, and the sound of their struggle blended with the cries of Malik and the murmurs of horrified passengers. Boyd snarled through clenched teeth, his face twisted with malice. "You don't give orders here," he hissed, his spittle hitting Darius's cheek. Darius, vision blurred by blood, refused to yield. He gritted his teeth, his mind screaming one thought over and over: I will not let them break me. He swung upward, his fist connecting with Boyd's jaw, but the effort cost him. Another blow from Boyd's elbow split his brow further, hot blood blinding his sight. His head swam, yet even in the haze, his eyes caught something that sparked a flicker of hope. Across the aisle, an older man in a brown jacket shifted deliberately, his movements slow and purposeful so as not to draw attention. Darius squinted through the blur and saw the glint of a phone slipping discreetly beneath the man's jacket. Their eyes met for a brief second. The man gave a subtle nod, a silent promise that he was recording. Relief surged through Darius's chest. An ally. Evidence was being gathered, and the truth would not die in this cabin. But Boyd was oblivious. "Reno, Brent, finish this," he barked, his voice booming with the arrogance of unchecked power. His command sliced through the tense silence, and in an instant, Reno and Brent lunged. Reno's grip was iron, his hands clamping down on Darius's shoulders as he shoved him into a row of seats. Brent grabbed hold of the duct tape roll, tearing it open with a screech that cut through the air like a blade. Passengers gasped, some rising halfway from their seats before freezing under Boyd's glare. "Sit down," he shouted, spit flying from his lips. "Sit down, or you'll join him." His voice was a whip, snapping the courage out of those who dared to move. Fear locked the cabin in place, leaving Darius to face his tormentors alone. Reno forced Darius's arms behind his back with brutal efficiency, twisting them until sharp pain shot up his shoulders. Darius clenched his jaw, refusing to cry out, though the strain made his muscles quiver. Brent circled like a predator, yanking strips of tape free with quick, violent motions. He wound them around Darius's wrists, pulling tight until the skin burned. The sticky sound of tape wrapping and sealing was louder than the plane's engines, drowning out even Malik's frantic cries. Bound at last, Darius was shoved down into a seat, his body slumped but his mind far from broken. Blood ran down the side of his face, soaking into his shirt, and his chest rose and fell with heavy breaths. He turned his head just enough to see Malik, still taped to the seat, his tiny body shaking with sobs. The sight burned deeper than any wound. Around them, passengers sat frozen in disbelief. Some clutched their phones tighter, their screens glowing faintly in defiance of Boyd's threats. Others looked away, shame etched in their faces, too afraid to act. The air was heavy with silence, a silence born of fear and cowardice, yet beneath it ran an undercurrent of tension, an invisible string being pulled tighter and tighter, threatening to snap. Darius closed his eyes briefly, forcing himself to steady his breathing. His ribs ached, his vision swam, but his thoughts were razor-sharp. He memorized every detail. Boyd's labored breathing, Reno's trembling grip that betrayed nerves beneath bravado, Brent's sweaty brow as he forced the tape tighter. He noted the passengers' faces who looked defiant, who looked guilty, who looked afraid. Every detail was a weapon he would one day wield. Boyd leaned in close, sneering. "Look at you now. Nothing but a broken man strapped to a chair." His voice dripped with triumph, but there was a tremor beneath it, a faint quiver that only someone as sharp as Darius could detect. Darius met his gaze, blood streaking his face, eyes blazing like coals in the dim cabin light. He did not speak. He did not need to. His silence carried more weight than any threat, more power than any plea. It was a silence that unnerved his captors, a silence that whispered of storms yet to come. For a moment, the cabin seemed to accept his defeat. To the passengers, to Boyd, to Reno and Brent, it looked as though the fight had been drained out of him. But within that bloodied and bound frame burned a fire no tape could restrain. He was not broken. He was waiting. And in that waiting, in that silence, something far greater was being forged. What they mistook for defeat was simply the silence before retribution. Boyd strutted down the narrow aisle with the swagger of a man who believed himself untouchable, his shoes striking the carpet with sharp confidence. He raised his chin high, his voice booming so that every corner of the cabin could hear him. "This," he declared, spreading his arms wide as if presiding over a courtroom, "is the discipline required to maintain order in the skies. Without authority, there is chaos." His tone carried the weight of false authority, but beneath it was the unmistakable gleam of malice. His words were not meant to reassure the passengers, they were meant to humiliate the man bleeding quietly in the corner, bound with duct tape like a criminal. Reno followed close behind, his smirk curling into something cruel. He leaned down to where Darius sat slumped against the seat, his arms pinned tight, his face smeared with blood. With a casual arrogance, Reno raised his hand and delivered a light slap across Darius's cheek. The sound was sharp, but not meant to injure. It was meant to mock, like a playground bully taunting a child. "Look at him," Reno said with a sneer, turning his head to the nearest row of passengers. The great man silenced, and all it took was a little tape. His laughter rang hollow, but it was enough to send a ripple of unease through those watching. Brent, not to be left out, walked slowly around Malik's seat where the baby whimpered faintly, his small face still streaked with dried tears. In Brent's hand, the roll of duct tape gleamed under the dim cabin lights. He twirled it like a prize, holding it up for the passengers to see, as though it were proof of their victory. "Discipline," he echoed Boyd's words mockingly, his grin wide and sharp. "Even the smallest ones must learn it." His fingers tightened around the tape as if daring anyone to challenge him. The baby whimpered louder, and a murmur ran through the rows, a collective sound of disgust that no one dared to voice openly. The passengers shifted in their seats, their whispers threading together like nervous static. Some men clenched their fists tight against their knees, their knuckles whitening, but they stayed seated, anchored by fear. They imagined what would happen if they stood, being arrested when the plane landed, blacklisted from flying, branded as threats. The fear of authority was heavy in the cabin, pressing down like the recycled air they all breathed. One man in the back leaned forward as if to rise, then stopped when Boyd's glare swept his way. The silence that followed was louder than any cry for help. Darius, his head hanging forward, heard every word, felt every strike, and registered every insult. His body ached, ribs throbbing with each shallow breath, blood trickling from a cut above his brow. Yet his mind was sharper than ever, watching, waiting, calculating. He noted the passengers who trembled, the ones who whispered, and the ones whose phones glowed faintly under jackets and seat cushions. Evidence was being gathered right before their eyes. Every slap, every sneer, every drop of blood was not erasing him. It was preserving their cruelty in a form that could not be erased. Boyd leaned down suddenly, his breath hot and bitter, his eyes narrowed to slits. "You think your fortune makes you untouchable? Up here, none of that matters. Up here, we decide what happens." His words dripped with the thrill of dominance. He wanted to see fear in Darius's eyes, wanted him to break, to plead. But Darius met his stare with silence, his expression unreadable beneath the swelling and bruises. That silence unsettled Boyd more than any shouted protest would have. Reno, growing restless, crouched beside Darius and tapped him lightly on the forehead with 2 fingers. "Say something," he taunted. "Beg, maybe. Tell us you're sorry for thinking you're better than the rest of us." His grin was wide, but the forced humor in his voice betrayed a nervous edge. Darius remained still, his breathing heavy but steady, his gaze unwavering. His silence was not weakness, it was a weapon, and the crew had no idea they were being cut by it. Across the cabin, a man in a business suit whispered urgently to the passenger beside him, "Record everything. Don't stop." His voice was low but determined, his phone angled just enough to capture the scene. Others followed quietly, their hands trembling but steady enough to hold their cameras up. The glow of the screens reflected in their eyes like flickers of defiance, though none of them dared speak it aloud. Brent, oblivious to the silent rebellion forming, lifted the roll of tape again, stretching a strip between his hands so that it snapped with a sharp crack. The sound made several passengers flinch. He grinned at the reaction, mistaking fear for submission. "You see," he said, looking around, "respect must be demanded." His words hung heavy, but behind them was a truth he did not see, that respect built on cruelty crumbles the moment the curtain is pulled back. Darius shifted slightly in his seat, the tape cutting into his skin as he straightened his back. Blood dripped slowly from his chin, spotting the carpet below. His silence filled the cabin with more weight than Boyd's lectures ever could. Each passenger felt it, an invisible pressure that promised the story was not over, that the man, bound before them, was not defeated. The tension in the cabin pulsed like a drumbeat, rising and falling with each insult hurled, each taunt delivered. Dramatic irony hung in the air so thick it was almost tangible. The crew believed they had silenced their victim, believed they had broken his spirit. But every laugh, every boast, every mocking slap was nothing more than another rope they tied around their own necks. Bound, bloodied, and beaten, Darius let his silence become louder than any scream. "Sometimes the most dangerous man in the room is the one who refuses to speak." Boyd's fist hovered inches above Malik's tiny, trembling face. The cabin fell into a suffocating silence, broken only by the baby's muffled whimpers and the shallow, anxious breaths of passengers too afraid to intervene. Then, all at once, a collective gasp swept through the rows like a wave of awakening. For the first time, even the most passive passengers seemed to realize that what they were witnessing had crossed the line from cruelty into inhuman savagery. The brutality had escalated past discipline, past authority. It was an assault on innocence itself. Darius, still bound in his seat, blood streaking down his chin, let out a guttural sound. Not quite a word, but something primal and raw. It reverberated through the cabin, shaking the passengers in their seats. His eyes blazed, unblinking and alive with fury, and for a split second Boyd faltered. The raised fist trembled, not from pity but from the sudden realization that the cabin itself seemed to be shifting against him. It was in that heartbeat of hesitation that it happened. A young man in a gray suit, barely more than 25 by the look of him, stood up with his voice slicing through the silence like a blade. "Enough!" he shouted, his tone filled with a courage that startled even himself. The words cracked through the oppressive air, leaving no room for retreat. All eyes swung toward him, passengers, crew, even Darius, who lifted his head slightly, meeting the man's gaze with a flicker of recognition. Someone had chosen to stand. The crew froze, caught off guard by the defiance. Boyd's lips curled into a sneer as he turned toward the man, his fist lowering slightly but not in surrender, more in confusion. Reno muttered under his breath, his eyes darting uneasily across the cabin. Brent shifted his weight, gripping the duct tape like a weapon, but his posture betrayed hesitation. For the first time, cracks appeared in the armor of their authority. That single act of defiance proved contagious. Another passenger, seated near the middle rows, slowly rose, his phone held high with the camera light glowing like a beacon. Then another followed, and another, until a dozen small lights shimmered across the cabin. Cameras were now aimed squarely at Boyd, Reno, and Brent. The very tools the crew had wielded to intimidate, their uniforms, their voices, their false authority, were now being stripped away by the silent, undeniable power of evidence. Boyd snarled, his voice low and venomous. "Sit down before you regret it." Yet the words lacked their earlier force. His eyes flickered, betraying the faintest trace of doubt as more passengers raised their phones, capturing every twitch of his anger. Dramatic irony lingered thick in the air. The men who believed they held power through fear were now being cornered by the truth of their own actions. The young man in the gray suit didn't waver. His hands trembled slightly, but his voice grew stronger as he added, "We've seen enough. Touch him again, and the world will see who you really are." His defiance was more than words. It was a mirror held up to the crew's cruelty. Darius sat motionless, though inside his heart pounded against his ribs. Bound and bloodied, he understood better than anyone what was unfolding. This was the first turning of the tide. He did not need to rise yet, did not need to scream or fight. The passengers were beginning to see, to act, to resist. His silence, his blood, his suffering had become the spark for rebellion. Boyd's face hardened, but his shoulders betrayed unease. Reno shifted back toward the galley, eyes darting nervously. Brent glanced at the passengers, then at Boyd, his grip on the tape loosening just slightly. Around them, whispers grew louder, faint but insistent murmurs of outrage spreading like kindling catching flame. In that moment, the balance of the cabin shifted. What once was unquestioned dominance had become shaky ground. The uniform no longer held weight. The raised fist no longer promised obedience. Instead, the cabin itself, the very people they had mocked and silenced, was rising against them. Darius tilted his head upward, meeting Boyd's eyes with a calm that felt more dangerous than fury. Blood ran in thin lines across his face, but his gaze burned with an unspoken vow. Their cruelty had gone too far, and justice was coming. The silence of his restraint was louder than Boyd's threats. For the first time since the ordeal began, the crew looked uncertain. Their posture, once brimming with arrogance, now faltered under the scrutiny of dozens of unblinking cameras. Boyd's hand twitched as though he wanted to lash out, but the power he had clung to was slipping, unraveling thread by thread. The cabin felt alive, charged with something undeniable. Passengers who had once shrunk back were now sitting taller, their eyes sharper, their phones steady in their hands. The air crackled with the promise of change, a foreshadowing that could not be ignored. Soon, Boyd, Reno, and Brent would not simply lose their grip on the passengers, they would lose everything they thought untouchable. Darius closed his eyes for a moment, exhaling through the pain, his silence carrying the weight of a storm about to break. When he opened them again, the glow of the phones reflected off his pupils like sparks in the dark. He did not need to move. He only needed to endure. The tide was turning, and he was its center. The cruel man had crossed too far, and the crowd was no longer entirely theirs to control. Foreshadowing blazed across the cabin. Soon they would not just lose control of the passengers, they would lose everything. The sky itself had turned against them, and justice was beginning to stir. The illusion of control cracked the instant Boyd's voice faltered. His attempt to bark orders at the restless cabin came out thin, trembling against the chorus of camera shutters and the hushed murmurs of passengers who had finally risen from silence. Reno, desperate to reassert dominance, shoved a man in a navy suit back into his seat with unnecessary force. The thud of the man's back against the cushion drew a collective gasp, and more phones angled forward, their lenses glowing like small torches in the dimly lit aisle. Brent lunged at another passenger, his hand outstretched to snatch away a phone, but the man recoiled and shoved him back with surprising strength. Brent stumbled, his composure cracking along with his authority. The cabin, once subdued by fear, now throbbed with a quiet defiance. Passengers stood shoulder to shoulder, some trembling but none lowering their cameras. The recording lights captured every grimace, every shove, every desperate gesture of the crew. The walls of silence had finally collapsed. The air itself seemed charged, alive with the weight of consequence pressing down on the three men who had reveled in cruelty only moments before. In the middle of it all, Darius sat bloodied, his arms still bound, his body bruised. His breath came slow and steady, his gaze unwavering from where Malik was taped. Then his voice cut through the chaos, deeper than the turbulence outside, carrying a gravity that stilled the entire cabin. "Unbind my son." The words were not shouted. They were spoken with such terrifying calm that every ear caught them, every heart skipped a beat. Heads turned in unison toward Darius, the beaten man who somehow now commanded the entire room. Boyd sneered, forcing his lips into a crooked grin, but his eyes betrayed him, darting nervously, glinting with fear he could no longer mask. The silence that followed was broken only by Malik's muffled whimpers and the mechanical hum of the engines pressing forward through the night. Passengers exchanged glances as if silently agreeing that this moment marked a turning point. Then, from the back, a single voice rose, trembling but firm. "Untape the baby!" Another voice joined, and then another, until the chant spread row by row. "Untape the baby! Untape the baby!" The sound swelled, echoing against the narrow walls, impossible to ignore. Boyd spun toward the crowd, his authority dissolving with every syllable hurled back at him. "Sit down, everyone sit down," he barked, but the words carried no weight now. Reno shifted uneasily, his eyes darting from passenger to passenger, as if searching for one last spark of fear to cling to. Brent clenched his jaw, gripping the roll of duct tape in his hand like a weapon, though his fingers trembled against its edge. The chant only grew louder, blending with the relentless whir of engines, pounding like a drumbeat that heralded collapse. Darius leaned forward, bound but unbroken, his bloodied face lit by the glow of dozens of phones aimed at him. His eyes burned with an intensity that cut deeper than any blade. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter than before, but sharper, each word honed like steel. "Every second you hesitate," he whispered, his tone so cold it seemed to drop the temperature in the cabin, "is another nail in your coffin." Nearby, passengers shivered as though the words had carried a chill through the recycled air. Boyd's breath caught, his mask of command slipping further. The attendants who had once seemed invincible were now cornered, trapped by truth and the unshakable will of the man they had tried to break. The foreshadowing was unmistakable. They weren't facing just a victim anymore. They were facing a man whose reach extended far beyond the cramped cabin. The first cracks of their downfall had split wide open. The turbulence eased, and the cabin steadied with an uneasy calm when the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. The metallic distortion of his words carried an authority that silenced the murmurs of passengers. "This is the captain. What is the nature of the disturbance in the cabin?" His question lingered in the pressurized air, heavy with expectation. Boyd's head snapped toward the ceiling speaker, his jaw tightening. He seized the moment with the arrogance of a man who believed control was still his to claim. Stepping into the aisle, shoulders squared, he raised his voice so all could hear. "Captain, we have an unruly passenger traveling with a dangerous child," he declared, forcing authority into his tone. His words carried a brittle confidence, the kind that masked desperation. His eyes darted from row to row, searching for compliance, for silence, for the same fear that had sustained his power minutes before. But the silence that followed was not submission. It was resistance. "No!" A man in the fifth row shouted, his voice sharp and unshaken. Heads turned as he stood halfway out of his seat, phone raised high like a shield. "That's not true." Another passenger joined him, a middle-aged man with trembling hands but steady resolve. "They attacked him. We all saw it." Suddenly, voices rose across the cabin. "It's a lie," one cried. "He's the victim, not the threat," another insisted. The dark cabin, lit faintly by overhead reading lights, began to glow with a new defiance as phones illuminated, screens held aloft like lanterns of truth. The devices captured Boyd's scowl, the fear flickering in Reno's eyes, and the frantic movements of Brent, whose panic betrayed him more than any camera could. The captain's silence returned over the intercom, but this time it thundered louder than any order. The lack of affirmation left the crew exposed. The weight of 100 unblinking lenses bore down on them, stripping away their illusions of control. Brent's mask cracked first. His hands shook violently as he rushed toward Malik. His breath came fast, shallow gasps as he fumbled at the duct tape. Passengers leaned forward, holding their phones steady, recording every frantic tug. "See, look," Brent stammered, his voice breaking as he yanked away strip after strip. Malik whimpered as the tape tore from his fragile skin, his small body trembling against the cold air. But Brent's desperation betrayed him. The passengers were not moved by compliance, they were horrified by the evidence already carved into Malik's swollen cheek, the blood crusting beneath his tiny nose. A child's suffering could not be undone by a panicked display of remorse. Darius watched, his chest heaving with ragged breaths, the taste of blood still iron-heavy on his tongue. His arms ached from the restraints, his body throbbed with pain, but his eyes, sharp, blazing, unwavering, locked onto the crew. The silence he had kept until now was no longer endurance. It was the gathering of a storm. Finally, his voice broke through, low, controlled, each syllable striking like a hammer against steel. "You will beg for mercy before we land." The words cut through the cabin with chilling precision. Every passenger felt them, their spines stiffening, their breath catching in their throats. Boyd, for the first time, faltered. His sneer faltered into hesitation, his hand gripping the duct tape roll so tightly his knuckles whitened. He glanced around, searching for support, but found only burning eyes fixed upon him. Passengers whispered, their voices hushed but heavy with a shared promise. "He's right," one said. "They'll pay for this." Another muttered, "Justice is coming." The air itself seemed to turn colder, heavier, as if the walls of the plane were closing in on the tormentors. Dramatic irony cloaked the scene. They still believed they had a chance to salvage control, but the balance had already shifted. Their downfall was not just imminent, it was inevitable. Darius's words lingered in the charged silence, echoing against the hum of the engines and the quiet sobs of his child. Boyd's lips parted, but no words came. Reno shifted uneasily, his bravado cracked by the weight of collective hatred pressing in from every row. Brent stood frozen, his hands smeared with the remnants of tape he had ripped away too late. The passengers' eyes bore into them with unflinching judgment. The humiliation that Boyd had tried to inflict had been reversed. Now it was he and his men who trembled beneath the weight of exposure, their authority drowned in the flood of truth. And in the center of it all, bloodied but unbroken, Darius Kellen sat like a man who had already decided the outcome. His voice did not need to rise again, it had already sealed their fate. The hour of reckoning had finally boarded the plane. When the wheels of the Concordair jet screeched against the tarmac, the cabin was already thick with anticipation. The atmosphere buzzed with dread and disbelief, every passenger holding their breath as the aircraft slowed into its early landing. The cabin door hissed open, and what met the eyes of Boyd Trask, Reno Malloy, and Brent Calder was not the routine presence of ground staff or airline security. Instead, the jet bridge blazed with harsh white flashes of camera lights, their rhythm like the crackle of a storm, and beyond them stood a wall of uniformed officers. The sudden flood of cold air carried the shouts of reporters, microphones raised like spears, voices echoing demands for answers. Boyd's face drained of color as he realized the greeting was not for them, but for the man they had beaten and mocked. Darius Kellen rose slowly from his seat. Malik clutched tightly to his chest, his suit stained with blood and torn at the shoulder. His movements were deliberate, his silence heavier than any words. Around them, passengers leaned forward, eyes burning with silent testimony, their phones still recording. The story had already escaped the plane. It was waiting outside, hungrier than the men who had tried to suppress it. The first officers stepped in, boots striking the cabin floor with authority. Their hands went not to Darius, but to the crew. "Boyd Trask, Reno Malloy, Brent Calder, you're under investigation for assault and endangerment," one officer declared, his tone flat but laced with finality. Boyd raised his voice, desperation cracking through the bravado. This is a mistake. He was a threat, his child. His protests were drowned out by the collective uproar of passengers, voices rising as one. No, that's not true. Phones shot higher, lenses flashing as if to burn his words into shame. Reno's shoulders slumped, tears spilling down his cheeks. He stammered incoherently, shaking his head as if denying the reality closing around him. His hands trembled, his knees threatening to give way even before the cuffs locked around his wrists. Brent, wide-eyed and frantic, bolted toward the galley in a pathetic attempt to escape. He didn't make it 2 steps before an officer seized him, twisting his arms behind his back with ruthless efficiency. The metallic snap of handcuffs echoed like a verdict through the silent cabin. Boyd alone resisted, clinging to his authority like a drowning man grasping driftwood. He squared his shoulders, trying to summon the same commanding tone he had used to dominate the passengers hours earlier. "You don't understand who I am," he barked. "I've kept order in this cabin. I've enforced regulations. You can't." But the words faltered under the blinding evidence. Screens glowed all around him, frozen frames of his cruelty. Malik bound to a seat, his small face bloodied. Darius beaten and pinned. Every lie Boyd tried to spin was buried under those images. Darius stepped forward at last, his gait steady despite the blood staining his temple. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He looked directly at the men who had humiliated him, and then at the officers holding them. His silence carried more weight than Boyd's desperate shouts. A hush fell over the cabin. Passengers leaned in, their anticipation thick as if waiting for a judge to pass sentence. Darius adjusted Malik in his arms, pressing his son protectively against his chest, then finally spoke. His voice was low, calm, but sharpened like a blade. "Kneel." The word cut through the air, more powerful than a scream. Boyd froze, his face paling further. Reno collapsed almost instantly, his legs folding as though his body had given up its last reserve of defiance. Brent, trembling uncontrollably, followed suit, eyes darting between the cameras and the man they had tried to destroy. Boyd lingered a moment longer, his pride warring against inevitability, but then his knees bent, forced down not by strength, but by inevitability, the crushing weight of truth and consequence. The cabin erupted in murmurs, passengers whispering in awe, some lifting their phones higher to capture the image of 3 men, once predators of the sky, reduced to shadows of themselves on the narrow aisle floor. Outside, the flashes of reporters' cameras pulsed like lightning through the windows, illuminating the moment with a permanence no power could erase. Darius did not smile. His eyes, steady and unblinking, locked on the trembling crew who now knelt before him. His voice was quiet, but it carved itself into the silence like an unshakable decree. The predators of the sky had been reduced to begging on the ground. The headlines erupted before the passengers had even left the airport. By the time the sun rose the next morning, the footage had already circled the globe, each image more damning than the last. A crying infant taped to a seat, a father beaten bloody, and 3 uniformed attendants abusing their authority with reckless cruelty. News anchors replayed the grainy videos on loop, their voices filled with outrage. Concordair's logo flashed beside the scenes like a permanent scar, and the stock market responded with brutal efficiency. Within days, Concordair's value nosedived, billions of dollars wiped out in the time it took for truth to spread across screens. Inside Concordair's headquarters, panic replaced the usual corporate polish. The board of directors held back-to-back emergency sessions, the long mahogany table littered with papers, half-drunk cups of coffee, and trembling hands. Executives argued over strategy, their voices rising with desperation. "We can spin this," one insisted, his tie loosened, eyes darting toward the latest stock figures. Another slammed his fist against the table. "Spin what? The world saw it. We're finished if we don't act." But beneath the frantic debates, an unspoken truth gnawed at them all. The damage was no longer something they could contain. Darius, meanwhile, was not content with silence or sympathy. His face, still bruised and stitched, appeared on every network as he stood before reporters outside the courthouse. Dressed in a sharp black suit, his son, Malik, held carefully in his arms, Darius's voice carried with calm power. "This is not about me," he declared, his eyes fixed firmly on the cameras. "This is about every passenger who has ever felt powerless, every family who has been mistreated, and every life endangered by cruelty disguised as authority. This ends here." His words were not shouted. They were delivered with quiet conviction, which made them even more piercing. The lawsuit was swift and relentless. Darius's legal team, backed by his global influence, filed charges not only against Boyd, Reno, and Brent, but also against Concordaire's leadership. He accused them of cultivating a culture where cruelty went unchecked, where accountability was a foreign word, and where passengers' dignity was optional. In courtrooms filled with flashing cameras and packed galleries, evidence was laid bare. Videos from passengers, medical reports of Malik's injuries, and testimonies that painted the airline as complicit rather than isolated. Boyd sat in the defendant's chair with clenched fists, his once arrogant posture reduced to nervous twitches. Reno wept openly during testimony, his shoulders slumped like a man already defeated. Brent tried to mask fear with defiance, but every glance toward the gallery revealed his shaking hands. The gavel's strikes felt like thunder, each ruling against them, stripping away the thin armor of authority they had once wielded so arrogantly. The court's decision came faster than expected. The crew were stripped of their licenses, charged with assault and child endangerment, and sentenced with no possibility of returning to the skies. But Darius's fight stretched further than punishing 3 men. He pressed the judges to impose sweeping reforms on Concordair itself, mandatory retraining for all crew members, transparent passenger rights policies, and the creation of independent oversight boards to ensure such atrocities would never be repeated. What surprised the world most, however, was the path Darius chose for himself. When the court offered him monetary damages, millions in compensation for what he had endured, he shook his head. "I don't want your money," he said firmly, his voice echoing in the hushed chamber. "I want it used for something greater." Reporters leaned forward, pens scratching furiously as he revealed his demand. Every dollar would go toward establishing a foundation dedicated to protecting passengers and their families from abuse in the travel industry. The announcement stunned the public. Men across the gallery exchanged looks of disbelief, and even the presiding judge paused to collect himself before nodding solemnly. Darius had turned his pain into something indestructible, a weapon sharper than wealth, his dignity. Months later, in a glass-walled boardroom overlooking Capitol Heights, the fruits of that decision took shape. Darius sat at the head of the long table, Malik resting quietly beside him, now healed and smiling faintly as he scribbled with crayons on a notepad. Around the table, lawmakers, executives, and advocates signed new policies into law, reforms born from the blood-stained evidence of that terrible flight. Every signature was a promise, every word a safeguard. Darius said little during the session, his gaze steady, his thoughts far heavier than the polished room suggested. At his side, in a small leather case, rested the duct tape that had once bound his son. It was not displayed nor spoken of, but its presence was undeniable. Oh, others, it was just a strip of torn gray adhesive. To him, it was a symbol, not of pain, but of endurance, justice, and the price of dignity. As the pens lifted and the final agreements were sealed, Darius placed his hand gently over Malik's, steadying the boy's restless fingers. He looked across the room at the men who now nodded with respect rather than disdain, and felt no triumph, only resolve. The world had changed because of what had happened on that flight. And though scars remained, both visible and hidden, the fight had been worth it. From the ashes of cruelty, a new standard for dignity had been born. Minutes later, the tables turned. The CEO made the same crew beg for mercy. If you stand for protecting the innocent and demanding accountability, subscribe now. Together, we rise. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of racism, abuse of authority, and the explosive consequences of prejudice in positions of power. Its purpose is to raise awareness about systemic injustice, provoke thought about accountability, and inspire action toward fairness and protection for all.